honor for me and also a great pleasure to have the second possibility to welcome Professor Barbara Partee to give a talk at our Linguistic Monday. Actually, this is the last Monday of this academic year, so we really have, the highest points are at the end. So thank you very much for having accepted our invitation, and we are looking forward to your talk. This time it will be on the lexical semantics within formal semantics. So Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you again for inviting me. I have had a wonderful week, just over a week here. Have to come back again. I mean, it's been, I didn't realize, Ava told me it was 10 years since I had been here before. That's much too long. So I have to come back again sooner than that, because this is a wonderful place and wonderful group of people. So thank you for being here. So, okay, so formal semantics hasn't really been known for doing anything with lexical semantics. And sometimes I worry about that. So occasionally I think about, well, what have we done? What have we not done? What are the prospects for future? So the early important achievements of formal semantics that made it interesting for linguists were really in compositionality, as I talked about a week ago. Compositionality, you can think of studying the semantics of syntax. When you put expressions together, how do you get the meanings of the bigger expressions from the meanings of the smaller expressions and the syntactic structures that you've used to put them together? The parts of the lexicon that received serious attention were the parts most directly relevant to compositionality. There was rapid progress on a wide range of function words or morphemes and the constructions in which they occur. So determiners and especially quantifiers of all sorts, tense and aspect markers, plurality, negation, focus sensitive words like only and even, comparative and superlative morphemes, and things like that, places where parts of words are really part of the grammar in a sense. But for the open class content words, as is well known, Montague assigned semantic types to them, but did not try to specify their meanings. He considered their study an empirical matter outside of formal semantics proper. They were treated as unanalyzed constants, as in formal logic, to be assigned values by interpretation in a particular model. So for words like walk and run, he would say, okay, these are one place predicates, and maybe some more about their aspectual properties. But what's the difference between walk and run? He didn't try to say anything. Over the course of the history of formal semantics, there's been great progress on the study of some semantic properties of open class words, including, as I said, aspectual properties of verbs. Also context-sensitive properties of words like local and enemy. Also polarity items, negative and positive polarity items, functional and relational nouns, mass nouns, the difference between mass and count nouns, and more. These properties have sometimes been captured by means of meaning postulates, constraints on their interpretation in a model. That was a practice used by Montague that he got from Carnap. Sometimes via partial lexical decomposition, a practice that had been introduced by David Doughty in the 1970s, when he brought into formal semantics some things that had been done within generative semantics of Lakoff and Macaulay and those people. Lexical semantic research within formal semantics all concerns properties that are crucial in semantic composition. And these lexical studies have been driven by the goals of the compositional semantics. What has remained unanalyzed is what we might call the remainder of the content of ordinary open class words. Those are still treated by most formal semanticists as unanalyzed primitives. The issue of whether and how to try to add a fuller treatment of lexical content to formal semantics has a complex history, which I'll discuss a bit, but it was a side issue until quite recently. Lexical semantics still draws less attention within theoretical circles in the West. That's not true of, say, Appreciation's work in Russia, where lexical semantics is front and center, than it does in the context of cognitive and computational perspectives. There are theoreticians who explicitly defend the idea of leaving the remainder of the meaning of lexical items totally unanalyzed linguistically. Jerry Fodor was an active proponent of the idea that those things are just primitives. And the status of lexical meaning has figured in some major debates about the nature of semantic theory. Many of Chomsky's critiques of formal semantics as a whole are based on a consideration of lexical items that seem to have meaning. They're not just meaningless, but they don't seem to have anything close to reference, like the word chances, and he was taking chances when he did that. You know, what the chances are, that's not, you know, that's hard to say. Chomsky seems skeptical of anything semantic beyond a kind of syntactic level that he likes to call logical form. And on the other side, Putnam's classic argument for the claim that meanings aren't in the head, which for those of you who were at my talk for the philosophers last Thursday was a central issue, was based on words that act like rigid designators, like water and other natural kind terms, things whose meaning is really anchored to what substances there happen to be in the world. And Putnam argued for a strongly non-psychologistic basis for some kinds of lexical meaning, cases like water, where there seems to be direct reference. Those who consider the lexicon outside the realm of formal or other semantics tend not to think of it as part of linguistics at all, but rather part of a more general cognitive domain, perhaps part of general knowledge, not so modularly encapsulated as the truly linguistic knowledge. But even if one agrees with Montague's initial supposition that lexical semantics is a separate empirical field of study, and whether one calls it linguistic or not, the lexicon is certainly part of our language. And it would be good to understand its nature, how it's acquired, how it interfaces with the construction of sentence meaning and discourse interpretation. So here's the plan for the rest of today's talk. First, some issues of semantic competence, going back to Chomsky's competence performance distinction, and asking what are the goals of doing semantics? What counts as success? Is there a difference between describing what a person's language is and describing their competence in that language? I think for Chomsky, the answer should be no. But in the history of formal semantics, it has certainly seemed to presuppose the answer yes. These issues loom largest for lexical semantics, I believe. Then a bit of history, lexical semantics before and in the beginnings of formal semantics, approaches and disputes. And then some achievements of formal semantics in the realm of lexical semantics. I don't want this to be only a negative talk about what we don't do, right? Empirical achievements that don't require resolving foundational questions about what lexical meaning is. And then a bit more about meaning postulates, some of their appeal and how they connect to some early theories and possibly to distributional semantics and how they may avoid some theoretical pitfalls in attempts to do something like total decomposition of meaning. And then last, a few areas of theoretical progress. So Chomsky brought the notion of competence to the forefront and made it central to the goals of syntax, and by extension, presumably to all of linguistics. But for semantics, especially lexical semantics, it's not obvious that the unconscious knowledge of the native speaker actually characterizes the language they speak, as it seems to do so neatly in syntax. In syntax, if two speakers differ in their internal syntactic rules, then we just say they speak different languages, or at least different idiolects. There's no such thing as not knowing the syntactic rules of your language in the descriptive sense of grammar, right? What you know defines what your language is. The syntax of the language of a community is perhaps more problematic notion than the syntax of an idiolect, that's a kind of idealization or requires some explicit account of variation and how people understand each other in spite of variation. And in syntax, even for the lexicon, there are no worries in principle because the lexicon is finite. And at worst, it could be memorized. Not that we think that's what happens, but it doesn't raise these general problems. In semantics, on the other hand, some of the biggest worries about competence have concerned the lexicon. It's finite, but the question of what it is to know it is the hard part. So here's Putnam in 1975. This I mentioned Thursday for the philosophers. So Putnam wrote, so the theory of meaning came to rest on two unchallenged assumptions. First, that knowing the meaning of a term is just a matter of being in a certain psychological state. This is the Chomskyan idea that what you know, what's in your head determines what your language is. And secondly, that the meaning of a term in the sense of intention determines its extension, in this sense that sameness of intention determines sameness of extension. So the meaning of oak tree should determine which trees are actually oak trees. And Putnam wrote, I shall argue that these two assumptions are not jointly satisfied by any notion, let alone any notion of meaning. Putnam used his famous twin earth thought experiments to argue that nothing in the narrow psychological state of a language user determines that water denotes this H2O stuff rather than some other compound XYZ that happens to have all the same visible, etc., properties of water. And yet, given the causal history of the term in English, given the fact that H2O is the stuff that English speakers were exposed to when coining and passing on the term water, water in fact picks out H2O in our language. But if we were in some other possible world and having the same experiences, it might be XYZ there.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
No, I'm not talking to you. Sorry. And Putnam argued that even though he could not tell a beech from an elm, and now, excuse me, this one has Russian in it, and last week I had Czech in it. Beech, buk in Czech, yeah, and elm, yilm, right, in Czech. Yeah. In his language, did not both just mean some deciduous tree or other, but rather picked out the natural kinds, beech and elm, by virtue of his being part of a language community with a certain history. In both kinds of examples, the words pick out determinate kinds. They have a definite intention, a rigid intention and extension, but these are not determined by whatever semantic representation might be in the speaker's head, because for many speakers, those representations are very incomplete. And so it's not determined by the unconscious knowledge of the speaker. So this is the kind of problem that can arise for lexical semantics and does not arise for syntax. So there's no comparable problems in syntax. Putnam's arguments and related concerns about the lexicon led me to conclude in a series of early papers in interactions with philosophers and in early interdisciplinary cognitive science interactions that we really never completely know our language. When you start thinking about all these words that include names of birds and names of flowers and names of trees and minerals and things, lots of words we use, and we use them perfectly well, and we communicate with others depending on the fact that there is some fact of the matter about what they mean. And that seemed to be, and that conclusion that we don't completely know our language, that's not terrible. It's just very interesting because there's nothing like that for syntax. And I related that property of not completely knowing our language to the fact that some lexical meanings are theory dependent. And not only do we not know the whole theories, but theories also change. So the lexical meanings can change with them. And the role of experts for things like beech and elm and many other particular areas. And for what Quine talked about under the heading of meaning holism, that words depend on other words that they interact with for their meaning, and the way meanings change over time. And it also relates to the much greater interpersonal differences we find within lexical semantics than in syntax or phonology. So my conclusion was that our knowledge of meanings of many words that we use is incomplete and underspecified. In some, but not all cases, meanings themselves may be underspecified. That's true for a lot of social meanings, as social reality changes in various ways. The words that we're using to talk about social groups change with them. So those meanings may be partly open. For an example of such indeterminacy and change happening not in English and not only English, think about what's happening right now that same-sex marriage has become widely possible. The word husband and wife don't have the same lexical properties they used to. A sentence like Mary and I are wives is now ambiguous. It can mean we're married to each other, right? So just like Mary and I are sisters, right? But it can still be, as it used to be, Mary and I are wives, just like Mary and I are mothers. You know, it can be, we fulfill one side of a non-symmetrical relation. So as times change, the meanings of the words can change. So there's an alternative view, a historically major opposition point of view within linguistics. I associate it especially with Jackendoff and Jerry Fodor, that meanings should be thought of as something like mental concepts, perhaps in some innate language of thought. And that idea of an innate language of thought is something I would say I don't really know what it means. I can't say whether I believe it in it or not, because it's not clear enough to me what it would be like. But some people believe strongly that that's what meanings connect to, maybe what they are. This is a highly internalist picture. This is, in principle, you might be able to go with electrodes and find the meaning of some word here and here and here. Okay. Even though that view did not have the particular problems that model theoretic semantics did, I worried that it completely neglected an important higher order intention in language users. Namely, we intend to speak the same language as each other. So we know that language is a social phenomenon. And so I mean, this was, there's some nice quotes in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass about whether words can mean whatever you want them to mean. And yeah, Humpty Dumpty was sure they could not. So no, Humpty Dumpty was sure they could, right? And David Lewis's book Convention highlights that. Our words don't simply refer to our ideas. We have some commitments to reality and to one another when we assert things. So go back to Putnam's observation that he could not tell a beech from an elm, and hence he had no internal semantic features or concepts that would differentiate them in his head. That didn't mean that beech and elm were synonymous for him, even if he didn't know anything different about them. But it didn't mean that they were synonyms for him, because he believed they were not synonyms. He knew nothing about them, but having acquired words as he did, he knew they were two different kinds of trees. And he believed that beeches and elms were different kinds without being able to tell you any difference whatsoever. So that's part of the puzzle. One promising resolution to the foundational tension between Chomsky psychologism and formal semantics comes from recent arguments by Stalnaker and Burge about the need to revise how we think about psychological reality, revise how we think about things being in the head. So Putnam was taking a very literal Chomskyan kind of view when he was arguing against it, saying meanings ain't in the head. But Stalnaker later, 1989, said, well, look at it differently. We can say meanings are in the head, but they're not like goldfish in a goldfish bowl. They're like footprints in the sand. The problem was taking too narrow a view of in the head. Property of footprints in the sand is they're not footprints unless they were caused by a foot. I mean, an artist could come and do some footprint shaped things, but they wouldn't be actual footprints in the sand unless they were done by a foot. So footprints in the sand have a relation to some causal element that isn't what you see in the sand. So Stolniker said a representational system is a system that's capable in being in a range of alternative internal states that tend to be causally dependent on the environment in a systematic way. So this is getting away from this purely almost solipsistic notion of meanings in the head into a more relational notion that takes into account how things get into our head. Similarly, in the context of work on the philosophy of perception, on social anti-individualism, and on the origins of objectivity in a really nice book by Tyler Burge, he has argued that Chomsky's view of grammar in the mind underestimates the degree to which the natures of many mental states constitutively depend on relations between a subject matter beyond the individual that has those mental states. Well, between those states and a subject matter beyond the individual that has the states. Stolniker's and Burge's work suggests that we should combine work on individual semantic representations with much more research on how those representations come to have the external relational content that makes reference possible. So conclusion of this part, and I've just scratched the surface. The apparent tensions between formal semantics and the goals of linguistic theory of the competence of the language user were only apparent. Perception, compare language to perception. Perception involves a relation between a perceiver and an external objective reality. In the case of perception, that's not controversial. We don't think of perception as all hallucinations or just dreaming or something. Perception is normally veridical. It can be an error. Things can interfere with the process, so we can make mistakes about what we're perceiving. So reference and truth conditions, which is what the formal semanticists take as central to semantics, that involves relation between language user and external reality as well. Language is normally used and understood correctly, but language users can be mistaken also. Language, of course, goes beyond objective representation. Not all language is about the real world. No one suggests that truth conditions exhaust all of meaning, but the puzzle of how to relate basic truth conditional semantics to semantic competence in basic simple cases is resolvable by taking these Burge and Stolniker kinds of points of view. And cognitive science is becoming richer for it, because it expands the notion of what psychology, psychological reality, and cognitive science are about. They include things about relations to the world and not only what's going on interiorly. So a little bit of background. Leibniz articulated the goal of a characteristica universalis as part of his goal of designing a logically perfect language. One basic symbol for every basic concept, and everything built up compositionally from there. Of course, it was never achieved, but that idea has great appeal, and it's frequently rediscovered or reborn. 20th century logicians worked on strictly compositional semantics for the logics that they designed, with primitive constant symbols at the base. Those get assigned values in some model. That's how model theoretic semantics gets going. Among early linguists thinking about semantics, Fodor and Katz in the 1960s were the first to want to add a semantic component to Chomsky's grammar. And they posited universal semantic features, really thinking in a way on analogy with phonology and the phonological features. They had primitive ideas about compositionality, basically characterizing words by sets of features and taking unions of sets of features as you put words together. The generative semanticists like Lakoff, Macaulay, et cetera, in the 60s and 70s added logical structure based on first order logic, and a certain amount of semantic decomposition. So famously, kill was represented as cause to become not alive. Right? Anna Wierzbicka is probably the most persistent proponent of the idea of a set of universal semantic primes from which all lexical meanings can be composed. And she's done a great deal of interesting typological work on that basis. In general, most people are skeptical about ever being able to actually identify a finite set of semantic primitives from which you could get all meanings. But see Avery Andrews' interesting 2016 article on reconciling natural semantic meta-language with formal semantics. I think he's the only one who's thought in that direction that I know of. So Carnap introduced meaning postulates in his logical work. These are non-logical axioms that could be added to guarantee the validity of various intuitively valid arguments that are not logically valid, but by the combination of logic and aspects of lexical meaning. So for instance, to capture the fact that the word cousin is symmetrical, you could have a meaning postulate that says, for the word cousin, that says for all x, y, if x is a cousin of y, then y is a cousin of x. And you could have things that in the old-fashioned meanings of husband and wife, you could have meaning postulates that say, if x is the husband of y, then y is the wife of x. That's now only, that has to be weakened a little bit now. Right? So Montague included some meaning postulates in his work. He put it in terms of constraining which logically possible interpreted models could count as models for English. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Philosophers' reactions to linguists' semantic representations, I'm thinking back about the Fodor and Katz kind of features, as a way of doing semantics, is well represented by some strong words from David Lewis. That he called what Fodor and Katz were doing markeries, that they had invented a language of semantic markers, and they would write down these markers as the representations of meanings of words and put them together in some way. And David Lewis wrote, but we can know the markeries translation of an English sentence without knowing the first thing about the meaning of the English sentence, namely the conditions under which it would be true. Semantics with no treatment of truth conditions is not semantics. And he also wrote, translation into markeries is at best a substitute for real semantics, relying either on our unspoken competence at some future date as speakers of markeries, or on our ability to do real semantics, at least for the one language markeries. But linguists did presuppose tacit competence in markeries. They took it, or some kind of representation language, to be universal and innate, and many still do. I mean, markeries was like one candidate for a possible language of thought, which a lot of linguists believed in. To philosophers and logicians doing formal semantics, the language of markeries looked empty because it was an uninterpreted language. Some people compared it to saying, well, let's have little colored beads on a string, and these will be our features. And then we'll say, these colored beads are the features for this word, and these colored beads are the features for this word. It doesn't tell you anything about their meaning. And these features written with capital letters, if you haven't given their interpretation, also doesn't tell you anything about their meaning. On the other hand, to linguists in that time, around 1970, concern with truth looked really puzzling. That's what the philosophers of language and logicians were talking about. Linguists were trying to figure out mental representations that would underlie linguistic competence. What does that have to do with truth? When the linguistic relevance of truth conditions finally penetrated, we're not interested in truth, but we're interested in understanding a sentence is in part understanding what the world would have to be like for that sentence to be true. It's the truth conditions, not the actual truth. So when the linguistic relevance of truth conditions finally penetrated, the nature of linguistic semantics changed in terms of tools used, questions asked, and criteria of adequacy for semantic analyses. Looking forward, there could be a possible reconciliation if evolution can provide some of the external referential links needed to give innate semantic features the kind of external grounding Lewis demanded, and if learning mechanisms can be found to account for the external content of non-innate semantic features or morphemes. That's just a speculation. So, okay, so what are some empirical achievements of formal semantics in the domain of lexical semantics? Formal semantics has actually made a great many contributions to lexical semantics, even without any general theory of what lexical semantics is. As noted in the introduction, the emphasis has been on points of interface between lexical content and compositionality. And what has been studied has been certain aspects of lexical meaning, not lexical meanings as a whole. So as a prime early example, I think, is the study of verbal aspect, starting with early work by Dowdy, Bennett and Partee, Bach, Terry Parsons. The driving challenge was to account for the compositional interpretation of sentences, including various tenses and temporal adverbials, including in the kinds of entailments that had been cataloged by the philosopher Zeno Wendler, such as, if John is walking, then John has walked. But not, if John is building a house, then John has built a house. And with a verb like walk, the progressive entails the perfect. In a verb phrase like build a house, it does not. And that's to be explained. The different entailment patterns between John is walking and John is building a house evidently reflect the different Aktionsarten of the verbs walk and build. One is a process verb and the other is an accomplishment verb. Early work analyzed these aspectual properties of verbs of different Aktionsarten, states, processes, achievements, accomplishments, and semanticists developed accounts of much of their compositional behavior with tenses, auxiliary verbs, and temporal modifiers. That was fun. That's the kind of semantic problem we could get our hands on. At first, all was done in terms of times, moments, and intervals, without taking events as primitives in the ontology. But even without events, a lot of progress was made on the semantics of the perfect, of the progressive, of the difference between for an hour and in an hour, etc. For instance, to take one early idea that Michael Bennett and I had in our work, suppose build a house, that property, that verb phrase, is something that's basically true of an interval, not a moment. That some things like blink might be true of a moment of time, but build a house is true, let's say, of an interval. And then you might say that be building a house, the progressive, is something that's true at any moment in the interior of an interval of which build a house is true. And have built a house, the perfect, that's true at any moment following an interval of build a house. Even that primitive idea is enough to explain the non-entailment between John is building a house and John has built a house. So there was great progress in the ensuing decades. Incorporating events into models as well as times was one big advance. Terry Parsons, Bach, Angelika Kratzer, others. Also analyzing telicity, perfectivity and imperfectivity, and distinguishing them. Hannah Phillip and others have done a lot on that. Incorporating Reichenbachian distinctions among event time, reference time, and speech time. That was something that Wolfgang Klein did a lot of, and then Hans Kamp and others. And then shortly after, Link and Sharvey revolutionized the study of the mass count distinction in nouns and made great advances in the semantics of plurals. Their algebraic perspective was extended to the event domain by Bach and also by Link and by Parsons. So this subatomic analysis in Parsons' term of entities and events opened up more fine-grained semantic analyses of nouns and verbs, while still leaving unanalyzed the lexical remainder of all those nouns and verbs. Nothing was done to distinguish the semantic profiles, the semantic contents of lexical items whose aspectual profiles were the same, or whose nominal profiles in terms of mass count were the same. No analysis of dog versus cat or walk versus run, etc. But those advances in turn led to new insights into the interaction of aspect and quantification involving verbs and their arguments with various thematic roles and temporal modifiers. There's a whole rich area there with people like Dowdy, Krifka, and Philip doing a lot of important work. In recent decades, work on fine-grained event structure in the semantics of tense, aspect, and temporal modification has been enriched by typological work and by exciting work on language acquisition and language processing, reinforcing the psychological reality of these posited semantic properties. In those domains and others, progress in lexical semantics and progress in compositional semantics have gone hand in hand. And none of that has been impeded or prevented by the lack of an account of what is lexical semantics. I mean, I would say the mysteries are still huge. And if you try to say, well, but what is the meaning of a word? All of it, I believe, has been pretty much consistent with either of two approaches that I mentioned in the introduction. One would be to study semantic properties of lexical units, captured, for instance, by meaning postulates. You know, take a word, say it's got some meaning. We don't know about all the meaning, but we can tell you these important aspects of its meaning, and we can work with those to do the compositional semantics. Another approach is what you might call partial decomposition. In the early Dowdy work following Lakoff and others, it was decomposing into these things like cause, become, etc. In more recent work, it partly involves identifying functional heads or operators with specified properties and building up structured meanings, applied in a structured way to the unanalyzed meaning of a kind of given root lexical item. So I've focused on formal semantic achievements concerning verbs and nouns, and I could also mention a lot of work on adjectives, because this kind of work concerns the open class vocabulary, the part of the lexicon where formal semantics has the least to say and no general theory. I've done this partly in reaction to my own field, because I've often worried about the absence of a theory of lexical meaning, and I've worried about the tendency of formal semanticists to endorse Montagu's practice of leaving lexical semantics outside of semantics proper, possibly outside of linguistics proper. And in that respect, to partially side with Chomsky's skepticism toward semantics, towards real semantics. Here, I'm somewhat comforting myself by noting the contributions that formal semantics has made to lexical semantics, even in the most difficult area of the open class vocabulary. But I shouldn't neglect to also mention some of the achievements on our home turf, so to speak, such as the semantics of quantifiers, and one of my favorites, the semantics of cross-categorial conjunction. The semantics of cross-categorial conjunction, looking at and or, as they can conjoin not only sentences, but also determiner phrases, verb phrases, adjective phrases, and much more. That has turned out to be a really cool area. It's systematic. It seems to be pretty much universal, allowing for a finite number of marked exceptions in any language, but really largely universal. In this case, there was a time when I had done a lot of breaking my head kind of research, trying to think about semantics of belief sentences, which is just so hard. And then I got into working on semantics of conjunction, and that was just fun. You know, because you really knew when you had got something. And in the case of conjunction, the semantic analysis of the given lexical items, that's complete analysis. These are closed class items. Their content is really logical, so you really can describe them pretty completely. Montagu Montague in his own work had included the analysis of and connecting both sentences and verb phrases. He didn't do it for noun phrases because he was not ready to deal with plurals. As soon as you put and between noun phrases, you've got plurals. Right? And Doughty and others generalized what Montague had done to cover all of the what we call Boolean conjoinable categories. I did some work with Mats Ruth on that, and a lot of people have done neat stuff about that. The upshot is that conjunction seems to be a universal and distinct module of the grammar. It has properties very different from most of the rest of the grammar, syntactically and semantically. But yeah, both in syntax and in semantics, its properties seem to be special and very nearly universal. Of course, even with conjunction, the story is not complete, or is more puzzling than and work on it continues. Interaction with negation and other scope-bearing elements is non-trivial. And the relation between the so-called Boolean and, the and that starts from the and that conjoins sentences, and what we can call group-forming and, the ice cream and cake kind of, strawberries and ice cream kind of and. That's also non-trivial. Joad Winter has done a lot of work to try to unify them on a more abstract level. But the cross-categorial semantics of Boolean and is well enough understood and robust that it has come to be usable as a test for evaluating analyses of various other constructions. So as, for instance, as a way to argue in favor of having a one-place predicate type for noun phrases when you find them in predicative position, because there they can be conjoined with adjective phrases. You can say, John is intelligent and an authority on unicorns. So you're conjoining two different syntactic categories, but they have the same semantic type. So that becomes an argument for why noun phrases in predicate position have the same semantic type as adjectives. Conclusion, formal semantics has made contributions to aspects of lexical meaning, even without a theory of lexical meaning. So a little bit about meaning postulates. The use of meaning postulates in Montague's work seems somewhat ad hoc, and rather few semanticists have advocated such an approach in general. Vladimir Barshov and I have to some extent in some contexts. Edith Zimmerman demonstrated the danger of trying to use them to get around certain kinds of compositionality problems, showing that you have to use them with caution. But I believe they can be a very useful resource for lexical semantics for at least two reasons. First, from within the perspective of formal semantics, with the goal of doing something about lexical semantics, if you don't believe in or are agnostic about the existence of some set of universal semantic primitives, a la Verbitska, then the possibility of actually giving complete and non-circular definitions of all words seems impossible. Similarly, insofar as the interpretation of some words is presumed to be, at least in part, a matter of reference, as in the case of beech and elm, we may lack a meta language in which to specify that reference. But meaning postulates are a way to constrain, that is, partially specify lexical meanings without claiming to provide full definitions. Montague didn't use the word meaning postulates for the ones that he provided. He just called them constraints on possible models that were to count as models of English. Without them, any lexical item whose interpretation was not spelled out explicitly, and for him, those were be and, or, not, will, and have plus en, and necessarily, perhaps a few more, but just very few. So without them, any lexical item could, in principle, be given any model theoretic interpretation of the appropriate semantic type. Just as in logic, you have P and Q and R, and you can assign them whatever denotation of the given type you want. So some of his meaning postulates specified logical properties of some lexical items. So for instance, in the general case, he set things up so that all argument-taking expressions took intentional arguments. For example, all transitive verbs were given the semantic type appropriate for seek, because John seeks a unicorn doesn't require that there is a unicorn. So he had that be a set of properties kind of argument. So it was the intention of generalized quantifier as object. And then he used meaning postulates to state that some transitive verbs like eat and catch have meanings that amount to first order extensional relations. So he didn't specify the meanings of those words, but the meaning postulates of guaranteeing extensionality of certain argument places separated the extensional from the intensional verbs. Other meaning postulates were of a sort very relevant to the general issue of lexical semantics. These were meaning postulates that established word to word or word to phrase connections and guaranteeing the non-independence of various word meanings. So there's an example from his proper treatment of quantification paper, a meaning postulate guaranteeing the equivalence of seek and try to find. He used that in order to show the equivalence of his treatment of seek as a transitive verb, as a basic transitive verb, with a Quinean decompositional treatment of seek into try to find. So he was saying, if you give seek a fancy enough type, you don't have to decompose it into something else. But then in order to say that it is equivalent to that decomposition, you want a meaning postulate. Okay, so one can also use meaning postulates to specify lexical entailments, all of the is-a sorts, for instance, among subordinate, superordinate predicates, or converse relations among words like employer and employee, or to specify that relational word like cousin is symmetrical. Assuming that the meta language for expressing meaning postulates is rich enough to distinguish presuppositions from entailments, they can also be used to specify sortal requirements of argument-taking words, given that the sortal requirements on that poor has to have a liquid object, for instance, those are presuppositional requirements that can be done with meaning postulates. In general, almost any clauses that might be part of a lexical entry in an ordinary monolingual dictionary could be rephrased as meaning postulates, constraining the interpretation of the head word to being compatible with the interpretation of the given clauses in its dictionary entry. Thus, meaning postulates can be viewed as something like modest partial definitions. Modest in two ways. One is they don't pretend to be exhaustive or complete definition. And secondly, they are generally just connecting words to other words, not to external reality. And one would want a meta language for meaning postulates rich enough to include indexical and demonstrative elements, because you want, for instance, to be able to say that this afternoon is part of today. That follows from their meanings. And that requires having an account of the indexicality of words like today and this afternoon. And the second reason that meaning postulates may be useful seems relevant in the context of developments in distributional semantics. Distributional semantics, from the very little that I know about it, does not try to say anything about reference, but treats lexical semantics in terms of the distributions of words in texts. This goes back in a way to Zelig-Harris's observation that similarity of co-occurrence generally corresponds to similarity of meaning, as well as to similarity of syntactic category. Meaning postulates, at least prototypical ones, also relate words to words. They might thus be able to provide some sort of bridge between formal semantics and distributional semantics. I don't think it would be a very direct bridge, given that distributional vectors involve numbers that specify some kind of similarity metrics, and familiar sorts of meaning postulates don't say anything about similarity. Right? Putting a not in somewhere doesn't make things less similar in terms of word distribution, but does make their meanings very different. Right? But both meaning postulates and distributional semantics relate expressions to expressions, constraining reference without actually specifying reference. The methods of both can, I think, be easily adapted to describe specialized sublanguages, such as different dialects or sublanguages characterized by technical jargon or the like. Meaning postulates are at heart just axioms. And it's easy to imagine modeling the difference between one dialect and another, or a general versus a technical context, by differences in some choices of axioms. When I talked about symmetry the other day, I think I may have mentioned that Lila Gleitman and I had discovered we had slightly different meanings for collide. that she believed that when you say A and B collided, or when you say A collided with B, that both A and B must be moving. That collision always involves two things that are both moving. And I thought, oh, now in my dialect, I think only at least one must be moving. So you could have meaning postulates that characterize the difference between us. And in the case of distributional semantics, I suppose this kind of versatility is built in just simply by the choice of what data set you use as input. If you have two different people, you would merge with two slightly different sets of vectors for their meanings. But since I know so little about distributional semantics, and since the range of kinds of meaning postulates imaginable is so open-ended, these remarks can only be suggestive and speculative. There's a paper by Kornai and Kracht that I think is very interesting in that domain. Vladimir Barshov and I have appealed to meaning postulates in some works, building bridges between the rich Russian tradition of lexical semantics, especially Apprecian, and Western formal semantics, showing how to recast Apprecian's lexical portraits in terms of meaning postulates, at least to a primitive extent. So I want to close by mentioning 4 areas where formal semanticists and philosophers have, I think, made valuable contributions in theoretically important problem areas in formal semantics. These are all just thumbnail mentions, and the areas themselves are far from exhaustive. So take the problem of vagueness. That's a problem that's crucial to lexical semantics, but hardly arises at all for compositional semantics. Important work early on by Hans Kamp, Manfred Pinkal, and others. Supervaluation theory is one approach. There are various approaches to underspecificity, and work on prototype theory is relevant there. Another area is context dependence. Formal semanticists have helped to uncover how widespread the context dependence of lexical meanings is, not just in indexical and demonstrative words, but in words like local, neighbor, right, and left. There are several major approaches, some involving positing invisible pronouns somewhere in their representations, or parameters of interpretation. Prototype theory. So formal semanticists such as Kamp and Partee have tried to help clarify when prototype-like meanings really are part of semantics proper. For instance, with color terms like red, or some kind of artifact terms like chair. And when they're not, when words may have relatively sharp meanings, but prototype-like associated stereotypes. So like grandmother, you can imagine a prototype for grandmother, but similarity to that prototype does not determine whether you are a grandmother or not, right? And by suggesting tools for extending compositional semantic tools to deal with meanings that correspond to prototypes. And then the psychological reality puzzles that I was noting earlier. Major advances on that front have come from philosophers in recent decades, especially Stolniker and Burge, in work that is more philosophy of mind than philosophy of language proper. The crucial insight is that psychological states should not be thought of in the excessively internalist way. They should be conceived relationally. I think semanticists are still far from any agreed on theory of lexical meaning, or whether there can even be one, but it's nice to realize that does not prevent us from making progress. And that's it.